Okay, let's unpack this. The big news today, the announcement of a 90-day tariff rollback agreement between the United States and China.
That's right.
Given all the economic, headwinds we've all been feeling, this deep dive is really focused on what this truce actually means for us here in the U.S., trying to cut through the headline.
Exactly. And we're looking at the initial reports, the official statements coming out today, May 12th, 2025, about this agreement.
Right.
And, to really get why it matters for the U.S. audience, we have to remember the context. This long-running economic rivalry, it's gotten pretty intense lately.
Yeah, definitely impacting American businesses, consumers, you name it.
For sure.
So maybe let's rewind a bit to get a handle on where we are now, why this matters to, our jobs, our wallets.
Yeah.
How did things heat up so much?
Okay, yeah, the timeline is key here. You have to go back to January this year. The U.S. took a pretty big step then.
What was that?
Imposing tariffs on certain Chinese imports, and they went as high as, I think, 145%.
Wow, 145%. That's huge. American importers, consumers, they must have felt that directly.
Oh, absolutely. And the U.S. rationale, the public argument, was consistent.
What were they citing?
Things like unfair trade practices, definitely intellectual property theft, which, hits American innovation hard, and also accusations of currency manipulation.
Making it harder for U.S. companies to compete, basically.
That was the argument, yes.
And China, they weren't just going to sit back and take that, were they?
Yeah.
I mean, with tariffs that high hitting their export.
No, absolutely not. Beijing retaliated. They brought in their own tariffs, and they were pretty strategic about it.
Targeting specific U.S. sectors.
Exactly. Agriculture was a big one, which really hurt American farmers. Semiconductors impacting our tech sector, even green tech. And some of their rates climbed up near 125%.
Ouch. So hitting American companies trying to sell into China too.
Right. Tit for tat.
You can just imagine the chaos that caused.
All right.
What were the immediate, real-world consequences we saw here in the U.S. and, globally?
Well, the impact sort of rippled out. You saw volatility in the stock markets, lots of uncertainty for investors here.
Yeah, I remember that.
American farmers, huge uncertainty. There were protests, real concerns about livelihoods.
Right.
And globally, supply chains, which were already kind of fragile, right? They got disrupted even more.
I mean, potentially higher prices for us consumers.
Potentially, yeah. And multinational corporations, the ones with feet in both countries, they were really struggling, increased costs, logistical nightmares.
And this wasn't purely economics, was it? There had to be political angles on both sides.
Oh, definitely. Here, the Biden administration was facing domestic pressure, needed to look tough on China trade, especially in certain states' manufacturing areas. And at the same time, China was gearing up for its 15th five-year plan. That's their big economic strategy document. So that likely played into how they reacted too.
Okay, so months of this back and forth, things getting pretty tense, and then suddenly, boom, this 90-day truce is announced. What changed? Why now?
I think fundamentally the economic pain on both sides just kept mounting. Neither economy is, totally immune.
So it started to bite too hard for everyone.
It seems that way. That shared pain likely created this growing urgency, a need to find some kind of off-ramp or at least hit pause and reassess.
So it wasn't just like a sudden breakthrough. There must have been talks happening quietly.
Yeah, reports suggest there was definitely some back-channel diplomacy. A high-level Chinese delegation apparently visited Geneva back in April.
Ah, okay.
And those quieter talks probably set the stage for the more intense, though still pretty private, negotiations that led to this deal.
The stakes here were massive, right? Not just for the U.S. and China, but globally. The risk of wider fallout was real.
Absolutely. I mean, you had the specter of a global recession looming, especially with energy markets being so unstable and that persistent inflation hitting household budgets, right here in the U.S. and everywhere.
So de-escalating trade tensions became pretty critical in that context.
I think so, yeah.
And who were the key players, the ones who actually managed to sort of hammer out this initial agreement?
The names being highlighted in the reports are U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng. They seem to be the main negotiators in those final crucial stages.
Okay. Bessent and He Lifeng. Got it. So let's drill down into the agreement itself, this 90-day tariff rollback. What are the actual specifics? What's changing that might directly affect us, American consumers and businesses?
Okay, so the core of it is this mutual tariff reduction for 90 days. The U.S. is pulling back tariffs on specific things like electronics.
Like smartphones, laptops, stuff we buy all the time.
Exactly. Also, machinery, used in various U.S. industries and automotive components, that could eventually filter down to car prices, maybe.
Okay. And what about China? What are they rolling back?
In return, China's scaling back its tariffs on things like agricultural imports.
Good news for farmers, potentially.
Yeah,
Soybeans, corn.
that's the hope, yes. Soybeans, corn, also pharmaceuticals and some high-end manufactured goods coming from the U.S.
So this could offer some, immediate relief, maybe temporary, but
Right.
still relief on prices for certain goods and maybe a boost for some U.S. exports.
That's definitely the intended effect. And beyond the tariffs, there's also a commitment. Both sides agreed to restart more formal talks on those really tricky long-term issues.
The underlying stuff.
Right. Things like technology transfers, protecting American IP cyber practices, data privacy, all areas where the U.S. has had major concerns.
And you mentioned something interesting before about a neutral third party
Yeah.
overseeing this. How does that work? Why is that significant?
Yeah, that's quite notable. The agreement apparently includes having a neutral Swiss panel do a weekly review of the tariff rollbacks.
So Swiss. Okay.
Yeah, it introduces this element of impartial oversight. That's often a sticking point in these kinds of disputes. It suggests maybe an attempt to build in some transparency, some accountability, could boost confidence, perhaps.
That is interesting. A layer of oversight.
Yeah.
Okay, so the news breaks, the agreement's public. What was the immediate reaction, especially here in the U.S. markets, industries?
Well, the market reaction was pretty positive, pretty quick. The Dow Jones saw a noticeable jump,
Right. Investors breathing a sigh of relief, maybe.
reflecting that optimism, yeah. That maybe a really damaging trade war could be avoided, or at least paused for now.
Makes sense. Some potentially good news for American investors for a change. What about specific sectors? Who in the U.S. economy is feeling the most immediate hope, let's say?
Well, tech companies, for one, think Silicon Valley. Others who faced export controls or pressures in China, they're likely relieved at the idea of eased restrictions.
Okay.
And like we said, American soybean and corn producers, definitely optimistic about getting better access again to that huge Chinese market. That's crucial for them.
But let's be real here. Not everyone's popping champagne.
Right.
Right. There must be some skepticism about this being a long-term fix.
Oh, absolutely. Lots of analysts are quick to say, look, this is temporary. It's 90 days. It doesn't fix the fundamental structural problems that caused the conflict in the first place.
The core issues are still there.
Exactly. Some see it more as just a tactical pause, both sides needing to stop the bleeding, basically, rather than a true shift towards lasting trade peace.
And how are the politicians spinning this?
Mhm.
Here in the U.S., over in China. What are the messages we're hearing?
Well, predictable differences, The Biden administration is framing it as a reset, emphasizing strength, using diplomacy effectively for American interests.
Okay, strength through diplomacy.
Right. Meanwhile, Chinese state media, they're calling it a win-win, a victory for negotiation over confrontation, highlighting their willingness to find common ground.
So different narratives for different domestic audiences. Important for us to recognize that.
Definitely. Both sides want to project strength and success.
Even though, as you said, the underlying competition is still very much alive.
That's the crucial point for us to grasp, I think. This feels much more like a ceasefire in a bigger economic contest than, a final peace treaty. This strategic rivalry, especially in areas like AI, semiconductors, digital currency, that's not going away.
It's also probably worth thinking about who else is watching this closely. Did other countries play a role? And what are the wider ripples for the global economy?
Good question. It's likely that other players, maybe the EU, Japan, some Gulf countries, played quieter roles, encouraging dialogue, pushing for stability.
Because their economies are tied into this too.
Massively. They have a huge vested interest in seeing the US and China de-escalate.
What about a country like India? We hear a lot about them as a potential alternative for supply chains moving out of China. How does this truce affect that?
India has definitely been positioning itself that way. This 90-day truce might offer a temporary pause in those immediate trade tensions, but that longer-term trend, companies wanting to diversify supply chains, that's probably going to continue. So India likely still sees opportunity there.
And the big international bodies, IMF, World Bank, what's their take?
They welcomed it. Both the IMF and World Bank had warned pretty strongly about how bad an escalating U.S.-China trade fight could be for global growth. So any step towards de-escalation is seen as positive for overall stability.
Okay, so looking ahead now, what happens next? What should we, as the American audience, be watching for in the next few weeks, months?
The immediate focus has to be on these working groups. They're supposed to get together over the next 90 days
What's their goal?
to try and hammer out a more comprehensive, longer-term trade framework. Ideally, something that could cover critical stuff like digital trade rules, maybe AI governance, financial regulations.
Wow, that's ambitious.
Very.
Yeah.
And all things with huge implications for the future of the U.S. economy and, frankly, the global economy.
But as we've kind of hinted, there's always the risk these talks don't go anywhere, right? Or new problems pop up. What happens then?
Exactly. That's the big risk. If there's no real progress in 90 days, or if new fights break out, the tariff rollbacks just expire. And then we could easily see things escalate again, back to square one, with all that uncertainty for American businesses and consumers.
And domestic politics in both countries won't stand still either, will they? That must play a huge role.
Absolutely critical. Here in the U.S., you've got election campaigns heating up. Any perception of being soft on China can be politically risky.
Right.
And in China, the Communist Party has its own balancing act, needing economic reforms, but also projecting national strength and sovereignty. It's a tightrope for both governments.
Seeking stability, but without looking weak.
Precisely that.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. For us here in the U.S., what's the bottom line, the main takeaway from this 90-day deal?
I think for the U.S. audience, the key takeaway is this. It's a positive step, a welcome pause, but it is temporary. It's happening within a very complex, very long-term relationship.
So it's breathing room.
Exactly, breathing room.
Yeah.
An opportunity for de-escalation, for more negotiation, which is definitely better than things continuing to ramp up and potentially hurting the American economy more.
So for us, it's basically a wait-and-see period. We need to watch closely over these next 3 months, see if this truce actually leads to something more stable, more predictable for trade, or if it's just, a short break before things get tense again.
Precisely, and that really leads to the big question for you, the listener, to think about. Is this temporary pause enough? Enough to actually change the long-term path of the U.S.-China economic rivalry? Or are the underlying tensions just too deep for a lasting fix? What does this 90-day window really mean for the future of globalization, for international trade, especially from where we sit here in the U.S.? It's definitely a period worth watching very closely.